Red Alliance co-chair, and I see several other volunteers in the audience who help make this event a reality to spread the word and help get all of you here. So thank you everybody for being here tonight. I am really excited for this event ever since we first started talking about doing it. And it's my honor to introduce Jim and Monica. First, a little bit about Jim. Jim Walls is the past and founding director of Lake County Resources Initiative. Born and raised in Oregon, Jim worked for the NRCS in the Midwest, supporting farmers with soil and crop health before moving back to Lake County to start LCRI. Although retired, Jim is still actively involved with LCRI's work and is the chairman of the LCRI Board of Directors. Monica Guzman is a bridge builder, journalist, and entrepreneur. She's director of digital and storytelling at Braver Angels, host of the Seattle program Civic Cocktail, co-founder of the award-winning Seattle newsletter, The Evergrey, and author of the new book, I Never Thought of It That Way, How to Have Fearlessly Curious Conversations in Dangerously Divided Times. She is a Mexican immigrant and proud liberal daughter of conservative parents. Please help us welcome Jim and Monica, our guests this evening. Elise, if you would throw a spotlight on Jim and Monica and get them up on the screen, and hopefully not me anymore. And then we can get this started. So let's start out. I got a question for both you, Jim and Monica, to get us started. For those who weren't able to yet read Monica's book or watch Jim's film, could each of you give us a little background about yourselves, how the issues in the book and the film became important to you? Let's start with Monica. Oh, you're on mute. There we go.
Every time. I've been a journalist my whole career, and that means that I've taken very seriously the idea of having conversations that are aimed at understanding people, understanding issues, not judging people or even judging issues all that much. But the thread that led me to this work in a big way is the relationship with my parents. So they and I became American citizens in the year 2000. We're Mexican immigrants. I was 17 when they became citizens, so I was automatically naturalized. And that same year, the year 2000, I came home from school one day. I was in high school and dropped my backpack on the floor and looked up and saw a Bush Cheney sign on my mother's billboard above her desk. And I couldn't believe it. I just always assumed that they were going to lean Democrat the way I did. And that started all kinds of interesting conversations for 22 years that got very, very heated in 2015 when that campaign happened and Donald Trump was running for president. And that was when our conversations got the most heat. But the way I think of it is heat in conversation can be used to cook something, or it can be misused to burn something. And what it usually burns is a relationship, or it burns trust. So luckily, me and my parents were able to learn a lot about each other and understand a lot about each other. And as I was practicing journalism and watching how media was contributing to the polarization, not just locally in Seattle, but nationally, all across this country, it really, really made me concerned about how is it that we talk to each other? How is it that maybe we ought to be talking to each other? And how could we be more curious? So the book really came out of that. I never thought of it that way, how to have fearlessly curious conversations in dangerously divided times. As I was writing it, I also began volunteering with Braver Angels, and last year joined Braver Angels full time and have never looked back, because people are working on this and the strategies are real and they're awesome. And many of us know it. And trust can be rebuilt and reknit. And I'm really excited to see what's next.
Thank you, Monica. Oh, go ahead, Jim.
Okay. Yeah, as it was mentioned, I had a career with NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service. In my time, it was Soil Conservation Service. Half of that career while in the Midwest was doing a lot of no-till type work and build organic matter in soils, and gave me a background in earth scientist. And I have a wildlife biology degree. And then I moved to another program, moved to the state of Washington to get back on the West Coast, and under the Resource Conservation Development Program, which was a federal program that were nonprofits under the IRS. Most of them were nonprofits under the IRS, run by local people. And it was the middle of the spotted owl issue in court cases. And I got involved with the communities, the loss of mills, et cetera, and all that process. And started working between environmentalists and timber companies such as Weyerhaeuser and stuff. And I met Martin Goebel from Sustainable Northwest after a few years of that work. And he said, how would you like to go back home? Because 5 out of the 6 mills that were once here are gone now, and work with between environmentalists and the industry there. And I said, I'd love to. And I had 3 years to retire yet. And luckily, Martin went to Senator Wyden, and they made a deal and paid my salary to NRCS, and I could come home and still retire with retirement from the federal government and do this job.
Thank you, Jim. I've got follow-up questions for both of you, but before I ask them, real quick for the audience, I should have warned you that we are recording this tonight. So if you do not want to be on the recording, now is your fair chance to leave. Also, you will have the chance to ask questions tonight of Jim and Monica in just a moment. So as we get ready for that, get your questions prepared in your mind, raise your virtual hand here in Zoom, and or go ahead and pop a question into the chat, and we will get your questions of Jim and Monica asked. Finally, let me just cover some ground rules for the audience real quick. Some standard Braver Angels. We're here to understand and explain, not to convince anybody of anything. When you speak, remember that you're only speaking for yourself tonight. And of course, we ask that everybody be respectful in their comments and communication. All right. Jim and Monica, you had taken a trip to Sherman County, Oregon. And I think that will segue a little bit into some of your learnings there, and then some of the work that Jim has been doing. Could you tell us a little bit more about your trip?
Yeah, so I loved Jim seeing in the trailer, somebody was talking about Sherman County. Sherman County is one of the smallest counties in Oregon. It's on the banks of the Columbia River toward the north of the state. And it just so happens that it came up in this interactive Washington Post feature that me and my colleague were looking at in late 2016. After that election and the results and the effect on Seattle, which is a very democratic, very liberal place. Lots of questions, lots of shock among myself and fellow liberals. And we looked at this interactive that the Washington Post had produced, and it said, plug in your county anywhere in America, and we will spit out the county nearest to yours that voted exactly opposite in the presidential election. And it turned out that the nearest county to King County, Washington that did that was Sherman County, Oregon. So from there, we asked a strange question. We said, well, what if we could meet people from Sherman County, Oregon? What if we could actually get curious about them, with them together? What if we could just have a visit? What would that look like? And it sounded like a crazy idea. It certainly felt like a crazy idea. We asked our newsletter readers, so my colleague and I had founded the Evergrey, a newsletter in Seattle, would this be interesting to you if there were some way to learn about Sherman County and this mirror image that we seem to have, and try to explore that? And a lot of folks said, yeah, in Seattle, a lot of people said, I don't even know any Republicans, any conservatives, let alone folks who are more rural. Like, that's alien to me. That would be really cool. So then began some really interesting Googling. And I ended up discovering Sherry Caseberg, a lovely woman who's a community leader in Sherman County and has been writing the Sherman County e-news for some time. And a phone call with her that was basically a cold call where I just laid out the idea, what if we could partner? What if we could make something happen? Resulted in this trip. So long story short, through a partnership with these incredible folks in Sherman County, we took a 5-hour rented bus ride down, 20 people from Seattle, and spent about 4 to 5 hours with about 16, 17 people from Sherman County in the county seat of Morrow. And it was an extraordinary visit. We started by taking a short bus tour just to see the rolling wheat fields and understand how important it was to the agriculture, to the economy of Sherman County. Then the folks in Sherman County had donated the meal, and so we ate sandwiches with them. And only then did we start having conversations. And the point of it was to see each other as human first before we start asking any of the questions that were burning people up around politics. And we only scratched the surface. But one of the moments that I'll never forget was Darren Paget, who has a large farm in Sherman County, and is actually head of the U.S. Wheat Growers Association right now. I think he's chair. But anyway, he stood up, he's 6'9", and you could hear a pin drop when he pointed at the plates of leftover sandwich at one point and said to the city folks, if you only knew what it took to get that sandwich on your plate. And just, like everyone from the city was like, we have no idea what goes on here. And we're very humbled by that. And I think the folks from Sherman County were very eager to be seen and to have a chance to tell their story to these city folks who never come. So it really impacted all of us very deeply.
Yeah, something you said there, Monica, about seeing each other as humans.
Mm-hmm.
That's so important. It seems like it's been lost these days.
Absolutely.
Jim,
yeah.
A question for both of you, but starting with Jim. So you mentioned a little bit, Jim, a moment ago about how you had to sort of reach across the aisle to get renewable energy project off the ground out in Eastern Oregon. How have each of you been able to build trust with people across the aisle in order to get sort of these initiatives or just these conversations going?
That's not an easy task. I'll say that first off. But I think one of the bases, and my wife and I talk about this a lot, was that building trust was getting to know each other. And we would have people over to our house here, and we got a gazebo out back, and have a barbecue and a few drinks. Only a few, though. You don't want to get environmentalists and loggers together and have too many, or you got to fight on an agreement. So, but and we got to learn about families and each other, and we talked to each other. And as you started this program with some basic rules, we had some basic rules that you'd listen to each other with respect. You did not have to agree with ideas, but you would listen with respect and hear each other. And it takes a long process to get there, and then to get through all to where you come to a final agreement. But that's what works, I think, is that rules and getting to know each other.
Yeah, I'll completely agree with that. So Sherry Caseberg, the woman who we first contacted, ended up introducing us to Sandy McNabb, a longtime, really beloved agricultural agent in Sherman County. And so building trust with Sandy was really about, just as Jim said, was getting to know each other. At that time, I was a media entrepreneur building this whole thing here in Seattle. And the last thing that felt natural to me was to spend an hour on the phone with someone during work hours, building a relationship, not just laying out an agenda and planning an event. Sort of knew that one thing was going to be a lot better if the other thing was also getting done. And what was wonderful was I remember how I looked forward to phone calls with Sandy, just so looked forward to them. Sandy didn't have a cell phone, very proudly did not have a cell phone, had to know that he was home and that he would be around. And it was just casual and friendly. Oh, and just such a breath of fresh air in my day. And we would talk about all kinds of things. And it was that trust that really was part of the planning. It's just, you can't strategize around that. That's just being human. That's just being people together. And that's really what it took.
Thank you both. Let's see if there's any questions in the audience. I know that there has to be somebody with a burning question out there. Don't be shy, everybody. No questions yet? Susan Lindsay's got a question. Hi, Susan. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. First of all, thank you both for what you do. It's great. I'm not sure what my question is. I just want to say that I do a similar thing. I've been doing a similar thing with a cousin group for the last 2.5 years. I was real distressed when in the middle of the Trump presidency. So I called the most conservative cousin I had and said, tell me what I'm missing. And 2 years and umpteen Zoom calls later, we've expanded to about 10 cousins, and everybody's different. And one of the things that we found is that what a lot of, just like what you're saying, a lot of what we do is just getting to, know each other and catching up with each other, but we always pick a topic. Mm. And one of the things that we've come to agree to after years of not quite knowing how to handle this is, if somebody wants to talk about climate change or gender issues or anything, we ask the others in the group to just agree to find the thing that they can say yes to in what the other person's position is. It doesn't have to be everything, but there has to be something. And so we have, and then when there is not necessarily disagreement, but not maybe understanding everything that the other person is saying, is really ask questions and clarify, and then really listen and share stories where there may be a different point of view. So we're very careful, but it's just something that has worked really well. And I really wanted to share that, and particularly the thing about finding something that you can say yes to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll just comment on that. I think that that's so important. My mother, when I've asked her many times, what do you think makes this work? When you and I can talk about, gosh, like everything from police and racism to, you name it, everything. What makes it work? And without missing a beat, the first time that I asked her, really, really, truly listening for her answer, she said, it's that we acknowledge each other's good points. And it's that we're not afraid to say where we do agree, even if it's not about the big thing we're talking about. Because it feels like sometimes in conversations of disagreement, you want to hold your ground and you have deep convictions. So you might think, if I nod my head or if I agree with anything they're saying, they might mistake that for me giving in or being weak in the way that I hold my convictions. But I think it's just the opposite. It means that, you might be secure enough in your convictions to really be curious and lean into wanting to understand a different one. And you don't need to be so afraid that, somehow you'll be befuddled into believing something you don't. That's not really how it works. So acknowledging good points, it builds like a base camp almost up a mountain, and when you have a base camp, you can kind of sleep, you can rest, you can acclimate, and then you can climb higher. And it sounds like with your cousin group, that's something you were able to do.
And I'd like to comment too. I think that's so important to agree on the small things first. And then as you move along, then you can start saying, okay, the things that are more difficult, can we have some discussions on that? And time you become friends, know your families and do all this, you can have those discussions without yelling and screaming at each other.
And I would just add one more thing if I can, which is that it's stories, personal stories that make much more impact on the other person than ideas or trying to argue over current events. That never works. But telling the stories I mean, I've seen such huge changes in all of us around stories being told. Like one time we talked about that the conservative group had real funny ideas about the Black Lives Matter protest in Seattle. So, and they asked me, because I have a home in Seattle, and I said, well, I never went, but I have 3 other cousins in this that could join this group that could tell you about it. And they did. And they spent 2 hours telling them about it. And this conservative group just said, oh my gosh, I never thought I would change my mind about something like this. But what I realize is I've been only listening to one voice, and it didn't include this voice. But me talking not about a story, but just about ideas and stuff didn't make any impact. It was the young people's stories that made the impact.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. Isn't it amazing how that works? I think Jim touched on that a moment ago too, how getting people together to share stories is what helps bridge that connection and help bring understanding. All right, now the hands are popping up. Kobe.
Unmuted. Okay. I'm really glad that you're helping people understand each other's perspectives. And I have a question about how you would help people to do that in 2 specific cases. First of all, with people who are not willing to attend a workshop. I've attended some of your workshops and they've been very helpful. But what if people are not willing to attend a workshop? How is there still a way to help them see other people's point of view, and also people who see themselves as apolitical?
Okay, so just to repeat back the question, you're asking about if people can't attend a workshop about all of these skills, how do you still help them see another point of view? And then was the second part of that question, what if they're apolitical? Can you say more about that? What you mean by that?
Well, I don't know. What do I mean by that? Yes. I mean, I know people who in some cases say that they don't see political life as important. And in those cases, I'm not sure what to do with that.
Yeah, Jim, I don't know if you have ideas on this. I'll just say really quickly that I think a lot of the most important political debates are really underneath it all, a debate about what matters. And to someone, something matters a lot, and to someone else, it just doesn't. And so you end up trying to convince the other person that it matters, but they don't see how it matters to them by you talking about how it matters to you. And so that can be such a big challenge because somehow people have to see themselves in other people. And I think Susan's tip about sharing stories is really, really, really powerful there, because if people hear about the pain or the challenges that somebody goes through because of the way the world is, and here's the way it could change, that can make the difference. And Jim, what do you think?
Yeah, I think the film, The Other Side of the Hill, demonstrates that, because Oregon's split. There's the west side and the east side, and it happens to be Democratic and Republican on those perspectives. And the perspective of the other side is assumptions about us, about the other side, both ways. It works both ways. And when all of a sudden the other side of the hill came out, it made a connection with the west side, and they would call and they go, wait a minute, you're a Republican and you've done a climate change plan and you're going to offset all your carbon emissions in the next 5 years? How? We didn't know you cowboys and loggers did that stuff. And yeah, we do, but we got to know each other. And then that opened up the conversation. That film did more to bridge the East and West than I ever imagined could happen. It just really blew my mind how good it did. And it's that kind of stuff, I think, that helps. And not that I ever believe that I can convince everybody, or I don't want to convince everybody. Everybody's got their own opinion, but I like to discuss things with everybody.
I really like what you said, Jim, about assumptions, because assumptions are basically when we're certain about something we haven't even really asked yet. we haven't even tracked down the real answer. We've just believed an answer that our brain made up. We're assuming. And so in my research on curiosity, when you assume, when you think you know, you won't think to ask. And so that's another blocker, is if you have a lot of assumptions that you aren't aware of and you don't think to ask about them and leave them shaky in your head, you're going to walk around thinking that you already know everything you need to know about people who disagree with you, including maybe that no Republicans work on climate things, which is just not true.
Yeah, and I'll give you an example. A young man, well, he runs 2 ranches and he works for my wife. And he's having a meeting next week on how we can do soil management to store carbon, and he's bringing in all the ranchers to see if they can't do a trade analysis and do some experiments on doing that. And he calls himself the hippie rancher, hippie cowboy. And, it's just that kind of thinking. People don't think that other people think that way. They get this perception of somebody,
Hippie cowboy, that's going to stick with me. Thank you for the question, Kobe. Gary Scharf, you're up next.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you so much, Monica and Jim. It's so great to hear your perspective. I've been a volunteer for Braver Angels for a while, and one of the questions I have for you guys have just provided so much wisdom. I'm concerned about the fact that we have it feels like talking about politics generally is like trying to tiptoe your way through a minefield made of words. You can come up with this phrase or that phrase, and somebody, even though you had no intention of being offensive, takes real offense at it. And so part of what I find myself doing is just sort of stepping back. And I understand the value of sharing values with each other, or sharing stories with each other. But at some point, we do have really serious problems that need to be solved through our working together, even though that sort of verbal minefield is out there. My question to you is this: could each of you share a story relating how there was someone that you felt you really had to talk to about with regard to a serious issue where you knew you would disagree, and you found a way toward a successful conversation with that person?
Well, the one that comes to my mind is the forestry one, and the environmentalists and the loggers and the mill and stuff. The way we manage, and we had to have conversations, and we've made it through that whole process, through the faith and getting to know each other, and came to agreement on how we're going to manage. But one of the requirements from the environmental community was also to set up a monitoring program that's scientifically based, to monitor everything we're doing and to report back. And that's been going for 20 years now, I think, somewhere in there. And it took a long time to get there and talk through it. And I'm not sure I'm answering your question. And it was difficult sometimes. It was very difficult. But you just keep at it, I guess, and you do it respectfully. And as a facilitator of those processes, I made sure I kept that role. And I made sure it was clear what our goals were and how we would react with each other through that. I'm a little confused sometimes, Gary, about politics too, and how we get to work together better. But so I'm not sure I got that answer yet. In fact, I know I don't.
Yeah.
I'll share a story that was told to me by 2 Braver Angels who I interviewed, because I also storytell for Braver Angels and try to elevate some of what we're all learning together. And this was through a program that matches people so that they can walk a mile in each other's news. So they pair off. You kind of pick a theme or something you disagree with, and then you do actually share your news articles and they share their news articles, and you try to talk about some of the odd things that come up. And to your point, often what happens in this program, Gary, is exactly what you said. where words get in the way. So the story that I'm thinking of is Wynette and Vera. They wanted to talk about elections and such. And Vera, who's liberal, called it voter rights. I want to talk about voter rights. But for Wynette, it kind of sat with her a little oddly because for her, the issue was different. And so they talked about it. Before they talked about it, they talked about what they were talking about. What do they actually call it? And they decided that the only fair way to talk about, to name that issue so that they could both feel like it would be fair to their perspectives was to call it voter rights / election integrity. And that's the way they referred to it in their emails. And that's the way that all the universe of both of their concerns felt represented. So it's funny, right? But sometimes just what you call an issue is already slanted or might already be, trying to frame the issue so that only one set of perspectives is okay. And that gets really challenging because most of us don't have the time to slow down and look at our language that way. But I thought it was really cool that they were able to just say, well, something's just not sitting right with me when you call it that, and we can see examples of this all over the place where people talk about gun rights or, gun regulation. Okay, well, each of those names sort of goes in different directions, doesn't it? Or what have you. I'm not even sure I'm thinking of the right thing. But anyway, you get my point.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's very helpful.
I would also say, Polster called me the other night, here a month or so back and said, okay, and started asking questions and I was willing to answer. And he says, are you a liberal or a conservative? And I said, don't label me. If you want to continue this conversation, I'm not going to be put on a label because I've been on both sides of the street. Now, do you want to continue under those rules? Or do you want to end the conversation? Because so many times we're trying to label, when we start to talk. Well, set down the rules, don't label,
Right, rules over labels, personal stories over advocacy, I guess. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you for the question. Stella, you've got your hand up.
I do. Hi, I am Stella. It's true. I'm from Seattle originally, and I'm going to school at Lewis and Clark in Portland right now. And my question, I guess I'll also kind of start it with a personal story. Whenever I enter into political conversations where I know that another person believes something differently than me or has a really, really different life experience, I really often find myself in kind of the position of mediator, where I really just want the other person to feel really comfortable and feel really respected. And that's kind of always my highest priority in those conversations, especially because I know that there's often a feeling of like condescension when, especially like, young privileged Seattle young people are talking to conservative folks or folks from outside of the city. So I just never, ever want people to feel that. So my outlook in those conversations is always very managing their emotions and trying to subtly build empathy, but without really talking about my opinions ever. And I'm curious how both of you manage allowing other people to learn just as much from you as you can from them. Because in my situation, I often just get to hear about their points of view and, nod my head and say, oh, that's really interesting. Have you ever thought about this? But not really specifically talk about anything because I want to make them feel safe and heard. So I'm curious how you guys navigate that.
Jim, did you want to?
I'm thinking, because that's a tough one. That's
It is a
very
tough one.
And particularly when you get around politics. I think I follow a rule that I do ask first, like you do, and ask their opinion first. Then I say, here's what I think, not that I'm right, and I'll tell you a story along those lines of politics. My wife and I are both registered Republicans, and we do not like the way the Republican Party's gone lately. And she asked me the other day, are we going to join the Democrats. And I said, no, I'm going to go in and change the party. I'm going to work to do that, because we're not a democracy if we don't have at least two strong parties. And I know there's liberal and libertarian and other parties, but they're not strong. To be a democracy, we've got to have those things, and to walk away from it and not recognize that the one that you're with needs changing and not try to do something, I think would be the wrong thing to do. And by the way, I have also been a registered Democrat, so I walk both sides. I tell people I've never voted a straight line in my life, but anyway, that's my personality. I like to look at issues and make a decision, based on the issues and the facts.
Yeah, I have to say, Stella, I really connect with what you're saying, because I end up playing a very similar role. Again, having been a journalist in a lot of conversations, my job is not to share my opinion. It's purely to understand someone else. So I occupy that role very naturally. And I've thought about this too. It's just like, well, when do I talk, right? Luckily, I do have some strong opinions, and I am very eager to share them. And I have found some ways to to invite the other person to hear my opinion if they so choose. And maybe my favorite, there's a couple things that I like. One phrasing that I really like is, instead of saying I disagree, and then giving my opinion, I'll say, I'll acknowledge what they said. And the way they said it, that's really interesting, very cool, or something, genuine and specific that really stood out to me. And then I'll say, I look at it very differently. Can I tell you about that? And what that does is it gets a little bit of buy-in, so the other person can say, yeah, and then I feel like, okay, I have a little space here just to say how I look at it differently. There was one conversation. I went back to Sherman County in 2020, just to follow up several years after the first visit, with a bunch of folks, and ended up in an almost 4.5, 5-hour conversation with a couple folks who had come to the first event, and it was fantastic. And the moment, well, there were many amazing moments, but one of the moments that really stood out to me was, there was a moment when one of the farmers was really opening up about how angry he felt that people were, in his mind, destroying Portland, destroying Seattle, over these things that they wanted to change in the world. But I remember he said, how could you destroy your own downtown? How could you destroy your own downtown? How could that feel good? And of course, in my mind, as a liberal, that doesn't feel good. But I know that in the liberal mindset, and among many of my friends in Seattle, again, they look at it very differently. So when I heard him ask that question of confoundedness, how could they blah, 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 that kind of thing, how could they something? I said, well, if you're curious, I've talked with some folks who do see that very differently. Would you like to hear that perspective? Because it was basically like, he was asking the question, he was asking it more to express a total frustration. But as soon as I offered that, he was like, yeah, okay. And we kind of took the volume down, and I sort of shared a different perspective about what was at stake, and how for a lot of people, what happens to the downtowns is just not as important as what you're trying to change. But that doesn't mean that they want to destroy the down, it's all stuff. It just got very complex from there.
Monica, you just brought something to me I hadn't thought of. We're a lot alike. You're a reporter. I'm a facilitator. And I don't always express my opinions either. I will ask somebody when I'm facilitating a meeting, does anybody have another opinion, or what other somebody else like to say something, don't always get to state mine because you're facilitating.
Yeah, I love that. Just asking for more. People usually have more to say.
Get the conversation going.
Asking for permission to offer another perspective sounds an awful lot like a pivot in the lap skills, Monica.
That's right, it does, doesn't it?
Making a workshop or two.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, you've got a question.
I do. I am, you would have to say, on the weak side. I'm a Republican in the blue side of the state. how do you affect a conversation like this when I want to have it, but the people in power don't?
Jim, I think you might have more experience than me on this one.
I'm not sure about this one.
I
I'm
don't
not
know.
sure I can, Elizabeth, I've got an answer to that one. That's a tough one. I guess the problems I've been dealing with are our communities have and stuff, and trying to find common ground with people outside of the community. We haven't had that difficulty, or maybe that part of that population isn't being heard either. I don't know. I really don't know. That's the only honest answer I can give. I don't know.
I wonder, Elizabeth, could you be more specific about the kind of conversation that you would want to have, or in this situation, what kind of conversation would a person in power not want to have that you're curious about?
I'm thinking specifically about education, things that are being taught in the schools right now that I disagree with strongly, but they're already there. And it's really easy to say, well, we're already doing it, go away. You're a small voice, we can cover you up and not be heard. We're already funded, we already have the momentum going forward. How do you have a conversation when I really do want to understand where they're coming from and why they're doing this, that I feel from my perspective is very wrong and very damaging, but they're already doing it and they don't have to listen to me. How do you get that foot in the door?
Yeah, I mean, the word that's coming to mind is advocacy, that's where advocacy is important, and where you often can't do it alone. And people are building organizations to share concerns, especially when it seems like they've been ignored or not asked for. That's never, I don't know. I sort of, in my opinion, we're doing a lot of reactionary policy making and a lot of sidestepping, groups in our community that we don't understand. People in power will just rather, sometimes the urgency to move quickly becomes in their minds more important than the urgency to move as a whole. And that's unfortunate. Sometimes I suppose it's necessary if the urgency is really that great, sure. But even in those cases, there has to be some way to keep the door open to maybe we messed up, or maybe we need to keep thinking about this. So all I can think of is advocacy, which is almost like a whole other conversation.
Getting the group go to the school board, huh?
Yeah, that's tough.
You do that and you still have a school board that is very secure in their one-sidedness, and that's the biggest problem I'm facing, is how do you get a foot in the door and get somebody to engage in conversation who doesn't feel the need to.
Yeah.
And I will say that I've run across groups and people that we couldn't get to that, to a common ground. That has happened, and that, I think that will continue to happen. That's our freedom in this country. Can sometimes be the nemesis of it too, because we get to have our own opinions, and that's good. But you can't always, convince everybody.
I'll just say, one suggestion, I suppose, is kind of what Jim and I were talking about before. Building trust is just getting to know each other. I think that's what you said, Jim. And sometimes, these institutions, school boards, the mayor, city hall, they seem impenetrable, but they're really just made up of people. And it is possible to build a relationship with a person. So maybe you can't do it with a school board member, but maybe someone who works with the school board, right? Who knows? Maybe you can ask someone to coffee and introduce yourself extremely diplomatically and see what happens.
Yeah, and I gotta say, where I'm from in Lake County, we're less than one person per square mile. Rural development still calls us frontier. I'm related to the half of the people in this county, so our conversations are a little bit easier to have in that setting than in a metropolitan setting too.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Oh, Klamath County Library was up and then put their hand down. Klamath County, I'll come back to you if you still want to ask your question. In the meantime, I'll go to Christine. Christine, you're up.
First of all, I want to say thank you to both of you. It's just, I thought, oh man, what a great topic. I never thought of it that way. I've shared it with so many people. And I think some other people came on this call. And then the other thing is, Monica, when I know you were doing this kind of thing before, but when I read that you were working for Braver Angels as a storyteller, I thought, all right, that's how we do it. And so I have a story that I think this was about 4 years ago that I want to share, and it kind of goes back to about 5 people back when the question was kind of like, how do you get in conversations with people that don't necessarily want to have a conversation? And I think it's kind of like, oh, all right, well, I'll just be open here and see what happens. So I was on I live in Portland, Oregon. And I was on about, as I said, about 4 years ago on a public bus for a fairly short ride, actually. And a woman got on, maybe she was like 35 or 40 or something, and she was just like paying her flare and flailing around like this. And the guy sitting facing the center in front of, well, no, he turned around at me and he rolled his eyes and like, and I said, well, maybe she has CP. And he said, what's that? And I said, that's cerebral palsy. It's, so I described a little bit. Well, maybe, but, and he said, I've never seen anything like Portland. He said, there's nothing you don't see around here. And he was just going on. And I said, well, where are you from? And well, I moved here about 3 years ago or something like that. And he said, I'm from a town that's about 10,000 people. And I think they were in the Midwest or something. And I went, oh my gosh, what a shock. I mean, it's just like responding to him. And so then we chatted a little bit more and he said, well, and I said, well, we do have a bumper sticker around here that you see pretty often, which reads, keep Portland weird. And he said, well, I think, probably you and I are like really on different sides politically or something. I said, that's what I was thinking too. I bet we really are. And I said, and that's why I think it's like so important that we have conversations like this. And he's kind of like, and then I can't remember, we didn't say anything for a while. And I think maybe there were a couple of other little comments. And then when he went to get off, he kind of turned around and he said, now you have a good day. And I thought he was talking to somebody else. And I looked up and he was looking right at me. I mean, I thought that little bit of whatever was like a 10-minute ride or something, if it was that. And I thought, I have thought of that so many times as like, because I used to be really shy of anybody that might think differently, but it's like, he was just a person, and I wonder, I hope I run into him again. And I'm a person that thinks that eventually we'll meet a bunch of people in heaven. And if we do, I hope he's there. And I want to say, did you keep thinking about that too? Because I thought about that for years after, and I told that story.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. I'll just quickly say, I think that story speaks for itself, but there, we talk about curiosity and crossing the divide. Like it's this, that there's fire and brimstone and we're going to, do what we can and but it can also be really fun and delightful to make a connection with someone who's different. And there's a lot to discover and there's a lot to surprise yourself by. In a lot of ways, I feel more alive, right? When I have conversations with someone who thinks differently and can show me the world in a different light. It makes the world bigger. I feel in a lot of ways that these are times where the world grows smaller, both out of fear and also out of a sense of siloing, that we're all seeing it from, the side that we're comfortable with. But the world is infinitely complex and other people can show us that. And it's really pretty cool.
So I was going to write that to you, Monica, but now I told it.
Love it. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Klamath County is back. So we'll take the question from Klamath County Library, and then we'll come back to Franklin, Benjamin, and Clyde before we jump into breakout rooms for a few minutes. So Klamath County Library, somebody's got a question in there.
Yeah, I'm Mark Knight, and I live in Klamath Falls, and I'm not sure if my question has specifically for Klamath Falls, but it could apply everywhere, I'm not sure. But Klamath Falls is like a very open county with very little except for around Klamath Falls, which is about maybe 45 thousand people and maybe 60,000 in the county. And it's in Eastern Oregon. And so my question is that how do you bring people together of different viewpoints? I know that it's been a problem here. You always have a meeting in the library like we're doing here, and you get all the same people saying all the same things. But it's very hard. And I think maybe just if there was ways of, I think this is some of it is just that's what people are comfortable with, and how you get everybody to be comfortable with whatever it is that. So I don't know, what have you seen to get different people involved?
Jim, what do you think? Any experience on this?
Well, I think, just putting out the word that you're going to discuss an issue. Been on the town council, and we do that kind of thing when I was there. Put out the one on, on renewables here, and we built a climate change plan to offset all our climate change. And we announced that and had meetings on it and how we were, and wanted input and really listened to people. Not that we had total agreement on it. There's some people that really hate solar, and look at it, We're not going to change that.
I think there's also something to be said for getting to know, I guess, the structure of different communities in your community, because when I was running the Evergrey in Seattle, I made it a personal mission to bring as many different perspectives to the table as I could. So even though Seattle is very left and very this and very that, it was, no, we're going to have a mix of perspectives. We're going to have a mix of young and old. We're going to have a mix of white and non-white, the whole thing. I'm going to do what I can. And what I found myself working pretty hard on, one is we've talked about the importance of trust and relationships. So I ended up spending some of my time building personal relationships with folks who I knew represented more underrepresented perspectives. And so as I got to know them, I could say to them, I'd really like you to come to this event where we discuss homelessness or whatnot. And I'd really, can you bring your friends? There's one woman in particular who introduced me to a group of Seattle libertarians called Not Weird Seattle Libertarians. That's literally the name of the Facebook group. It's great. And I've gotten to know them over time, but they felt very othered a lot in Seattle politics. And, little by little, it's like you find your ways in. So sometimes it's just different communities have leaders or they'll have spaces where they meet. And if you get to know what those spaces are and get to know them, you can be the hub that pulls people together. It takes work. It takes relationships like everything else.
Thank you, Klamath County. Love the setup you have there in the library too. That's fantastic. Franklin, you've had your hand up a while. Thanks for being patient.
And thank you for being patient while I try to unmute. This type of work in terms of, especially in our current environment, of getting people with different perspectives together, at times can be exhausting and at times can be frustrating. And so what I would like to know is how you deal with that exhaustion and that frustration.
You got to be a little bit of a cheerleader. Our forced collaborative and coming to agreement was a 15-year process. And that takes a lot of patience, but everybody's got to be willing to move. But there was progress being made all that time. In fact, now I'm retired now, and I'm going back to work on it. I called a couple of environmentalists the other day. You cannot use biomass off federal lands. You pile it up. If you're logging, you put it in a slash pile and light a match to it. It doesn't make sense to me, And so I called them up and said, are you about with all the big fires? We just had almost a 600,000 acre fire here last year, Boot Lake fire. I go, are we ready to talk about how we responsibly do that and how we do it right and scientifically? So we're not over harvesting, but we're removing lateral fuels and doing that kind of stuff. And the person, the environmentalist Susan, said, I'm not sure we're quite there, Jim, but we're getting closer. I said, well, I think we may want to, let's have some discussions on that. Let's bring some people together.
Yeah, and I think going off that a bit, exhaustion for me is really helped by not feeling alone in the work. Before I started volunteering for Braver Angels, while I was working in journalism, but hadn't met enough other storytellers who sensed that journalism was missing something really big around the brokenness and trust across ideologies. Man, it was really hard because I was like, am I crazy? Am I crazy? To think that something's just wrong here? Does no one else want to do this? What's going on? And then when I found this incredible community of people, I mean, basically you're all in the right place. I lean on Braver Angels, but also other folks that I know who don't even have to work with organizations. I mean, people do this in their own communities. When I lean on those folks, everything's different and I find my energy again and my support.
I think long-term, you heard it in the trailer, I don't want to leave my grandkids in this world when it comes to climate change. I want to do what I can.
Yeah.
And that keeps my motivation going, you know.
Thank you, Franklin. Benjamin. It's a familiar face.
Yeah. Man, this has been such a delightful conversation. It's just refreshing to hear these perspectives. One of the things, this was referenced a little bit by Elizabeth earlier, just talking about certain conversations that some group that has sway doesn't necessarily need to happen or want to happen. One of the, as the Red co-chair for Braver Angels Oregon, and having just worked in conservative politics for a long time, I see a lot of the effect that power dynamics, like historical power dynamics, can have on people, where people start to build up this narrative of, oh, I'm never going to be heard. The trajectory's already set. I might as well just move to a different state, or I just need to go to some place where my people have power. That can tend to, and it happens on both sides, you know, in red dominant states, blue people just don't play. Same with like a blue dominant state, red people is just maybe say, I'm not going to play. I'm not going to participate. Or a lot of the time I see that then people kind of demand a reversal. So you have the, well, you're going to sit and listen to me tell you all the reasons you've hurt me. And I'm just going to talk and you're just going to listen. How have you found, what are ways that you found to diffuse the power dynamic in a way that gets somebody to come to the table who has been used to kind of the game not being fair for so long? Just curious your thoughts on that.
What an amazing question. Wow.
What a truism too.
Yeah, I think you just pointed out so many things. I'll share one thing that I think I was talking before about how our institutions feel impenetrable, right? City Hall and school boards. And I think that's part of it. It just feels like everything's already built, you know, that, yeah, it's a democracy, but what role do I play really other than voting? And maybe that doesn't even make that much of a difference. And I've spent a lot of time in local journalism working on that problem in particular, how to help people wake up and realize you're a citizen, like you're here, you're part of this. There's this city, this town is no one else's, it's yours. But it can be so hard to see that. So what I've seen really work in the context of everything feels too stuck, let's loosen it up, and in a way that people feel welcome and heard, is to have a conversation where the main question that you ask people is not what do we do, or, you know, what's your demands, but instead is what are your concerns? Just what are your concerns? And it's an information gathering. Everyone has a say, no questions asked, you know, about who's qualified or unqualified, just a completely open floor on what are your concerns is fabulous, because people kind of light up. I've seen people light up and be like, oh, that this matters now. And so I've seen this in civic type of contexts in Seattle, and also in some ways in Braver Angels town halls that we're experimenting with. But there's there's just a lot of like good theory behind why that works really well. So I think it's that. It's like we have Robert's Rules of Order, we have these particular processes where you're supposed to petition your blah, 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 blah. But if some civic leader can just say, you know what, I'm going to work just outside of this a little bit, break it down, dress it down, and just get people together like human beings, that can be the first step. And then people finish something like that all excited and go, what do I do next? And that's when you can say, well, maybe you can go to City Hall.
Anything else you want to add to that, Jim?
I think Monica covered that very well.
Great.
I know the problem.
For sure.
I just don't have the solution on that.
Well, thank you, Ben, for the question. Clive, you're up.
Thank you. So I kind of have more something that I'd like to just share. So for the past couple of years, I've been attending a meeting which is based out of Oregon, headed by Ward Cunningham, who was the engineer who wrote the original wiki technologies. And if you go take a look at a Wikipedia article on somebody who's got a lot of, somebody like Trump or the previous president, you go to the logs there and look at the logs, you'll see all sorts of reversions and arguments, which can sometimes get pretty nasty. And anyways, out of that, Wood, because he invented the original wiki technologies, took an opportunity to develop a different type of wiki, which is now actually is being taught in some of the Oregon schools at the children level, of course. And that is, it's a federated wiki. So it sort of takes the sting out of the tail of social media that has this ad tech driven stinger to it that sort of tends to bring out more the feelings of love and hate. And it just provides an authoring tool where you can author about the subject, but it doesn't have, it has a different type of feedback in it because you have to actually read the article, and it tends to be sort of columnist type articles you might find written by a journalist. And because of the, I don't know, because of the different type of authoring, but it, and you have your own wiki. So it's your wiki, and you can fork a wiki. In other words, you can share the wiki with somebody else, and then you can change their wiki. So anyways, you end up with a lot more written material, which is observable and readable, but it doesn't have this nasty feature of ad tech driven social media. So I'd like to just share that and just tell you that it's going on. I put a couple of links in the chat where you can find out about that. Thanks.
And
Thank you. I've opened that. Yeah, it looks cool. Sorry, Jim, go ahead. Sorry.
I just said opinions based on social media rather than science and peer review and other things is something that's causing a lot of problems in our society.
Yeah, welcome to the new world.
Yeah. Thank
you, Clive. Very useful. Becky, you're our last question before we move into breakout rooms.
Okay. This doesn't necessarily follow along with some of the other questions, but maybe a little bit with the burnout question. I've found that, well, first of all, I think there's been some research about feelings, mad, sad, glad, whatever, and that they found that there's one that isn't usually mentioned, which is disgust. And probably the easiest way to shut me down is, or make me mad, is to be disgusting toward me. And sometimes I've had conversations where suddenly there's no listening left. There's just practically name calling. And, we say we have to respect each other on this, and that's helpful. And I think we do when we have these Braver Angels conversations. But I find it very difficult to be brave enough to enter into a conversation with people that mostly what I've heard from them is just the disgust they have for other ideas or for the other side. And I would like some skills in somehow talking to myself to be able to even enter a conversation where I feel like, well, why should I enter into something where I'm just going to feel punished or put down? And again, feeling that I'm disgusting. I mean, I think that's true for anyone to try to absorb that. And I spend much more energy fighting that off than being able to be creative. And so I don't know if anyone has any insights into that.
I'd just say, as a facilitator in the meetings that I do facilitate, that I try to never let that happen, and I try to correct it when it comes up that way, you know, because everybody's opinion should be respected and listened to, not agreed to, but respected and listened to. And I try and make sure those are known rules.
Yeah, I'm really sorry that that happens as often as it probably does. I think that that is one of the really most tragic things that about where we are right now as a society, because, you know, okay, we disagree about a lot of things. Great. You know, if we allow ourselves to be creative, if we begin with the assumption that everybody has a valid perspective because they are a valid person, and so let's hear from their experience where they've come down on something and what they're worried about. Man, imagine everything we could do, but we don't, do we? Too often we begin with, that person isn't even worthy. I already know everything I need to know about them. And I think of the three horrible assumptions that we make. You're an idiot, you're crazy, or you're evil. But there's a sense of disgust that is turned on in us, you know, for each one of those assumptions. And they're always assumptions, always. And people don't see it. So I don't know that I have a grand answer for you, but one thing that did come to mind is, you know, there's ways that in my life that I have been dismissed. I think part of what I do is I know that it might be discussed, but I think of it as dismissal. I think of it as, oh, you're not seeing me. Let me help you with that. Anyway, it doesn't always work, but there's some part of me that, rather than being angry, just wants to figure out where is this person looking and how can I get in that field of view? Where does this person see? And let me go step into that landscape. I don't know if that's making any sense, but as I think about it, because you're really making me think, I think there are ways to do that. But it begins with not being disgusted by the disgust. And my goodness, is that hard?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think, Becky, you brought something to my mind. I think that's why I hate the label liberal and conservative, you know, because it dismisses you because you don't agree with me. You must be either liberal or, you know, however they're going to label you, you know. Yeah, I don't like that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for thinking about it. It's maybe an odd question, but I suspect that's one reason why people often won't get into conversations like that, because of, I mean, it's a wounding, can be. I appreciate, Monica, that you're able to reframe it quickly enough to, that was good. I liked your imagery there. So thank you.
You bet.
Well, thank you, Becky. And we're going to move into some small breakout rooms. We've got 3 discussion questions for you that I've just posted into the chat. We're going to spend 10 minutes in the rooms. You don't have to get through all this questions. Talk amongst yourselves as much as you can. And then when we come back together for the last few minutes, we'll allow you to share out any final thoughts, either from your group or from the evening. With that, Elise, take it away. All right. For the last 5-6 minutes or so, I'd love to start with anybody in the audience who has something they'd like to share out to the group about the takeaway from either the breakout rooms or the evening in general. Just a quick few words. We'll try and keep the comments brief and let as many people speak as would like to. Mac.
Yeah, hi. We didn't have a full discussion as we wanted to, obviously, with just a short amount of time we had, but I think sort of a summary of our little group discussion was that it's very difficult to talk with people who have differing points of view, and like how you can break those barriers. And I know, Monica, you talk, I tried to read some of your book. I haven't read all of it yet, but you talk about just being curious and listening full-heartedly. And I don't know if you can, either you or Jim can sort of elaborate more on other methodologies to be patient, listen to somebody, and try to break some of those barriers and troubling conversations that you can have.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I observed just tonight was what happens in a conversation when someone begins to tell a story. So we had a Q&A, but a few of you told stories in the context of your questions. And if you kind of observe what happens is everyone kind of slows down and enters this listening mode. I don't know that there's a word for it, but I feel like it's a different kind of listening. It's a calmer kind of listening. And it's one where in your head, you are drawing the picture the other person is telling you. This happened on the bus with this person, and this is what they said to me, and this is what I said to them. And you're painting that in your head. And we all imagine that together in our own ways. So in a conversation, when it is when you think it's going to be so hard to understand this other person or talk about what we disagree with, one of the best ways to both slow things down and see each other more clearly really is to switch into storytelling mode. So when you're tempted to say, well, this is what I think, what I would encourage you to do instead is ask yourself that question internally. Go, what do I think? And then instead of trying to say words or reasons that then you will then speak to the other person, look at the movie that plays in your head. And chances are you're seeing images from your past or images from things that matter to you. And those images might be telling a story. Can you pull that story out and communicate that story to the other person? And another thing that's really great is stories beget stories, right? So you share your story and somebody goes, oh, that happened to me too. Or let me tell you about the time that I realized what I believed. And so, yeah, stories have an extraordinary power because they're a lot harder to judge, and you can't argue with a story. You can't. There's nothing to argue about. It's somebody's experience. You can argue, I suppose, with the conclusion someone drew from it, but once you've heard the story, it makes more sense to you why they drew that conclusion themselves. And I could say a lot more, but I'll leave it there.
Final thoughts from Klamath County Library.
Yeah, I'm Jean Knight, and I think we agree. We thought that an important point was finding that one small point of agreement with the other person.
Absolutely. Thank you. Gary Scharf.
Thank you. Two quick takeaways are I am definitely buying Monica's book. I'm definitely checking out Jim's movie. I haven't gotten to it yet, but man, am I impressed. I'm so grateful for this project tonight. One thing that is a serious takeaway for me, I'm from Oregon. I'm actually in Bethesda, Maryland right now, visiting my son's two little girls. And one of the things I love about Braver Angels that I wanted to share with this group, I think Braver Angels has a perception of our national life that is not red versus blue. It's about the largest group of people who really want to be neighbors, want to be fellow citizens, want to find a way to be peaceable. And then there are people on the opposite sides of both parties that somehow thrive on conflict. Maybe they make money off of fundraising letters, or they stir up their base to vote, whatever their strategies are. But it's that vision of Braver Angels that to me goes deepest to where people live. And one thing that wasn't mentioned tonight that I just want to throw out there is our children. Our children are going to be living in the world that we leave behind us. We teach our children to be kind. And Braver Angels is all about that. And respect and listening are essential to that way of being a person in the world in the presence of our children. So thank you so much for this project.
Thank you, Gary. Great thoughts. Michelle, what are you taking away?
Well, actually, I just wanted to say to everyone who spoke or told a story or asked a question or whatever, I'm grateful to every single one of you. I learned from everyone who spoke, so I appreciate that. Thanks. And also thank you to both Monica and Jim, two really different styles, two beautiful contributions to being human with each other. And I appreciate both of you very much. That's all I wanted to say.
Michelle, I'd like to say that you just hit a point that's been part of my life for a long time. I tell the kids that work for me on the monitoring crew and stuff, how do you become, they'll ask, how do you become successful and get things done? I said, I listen and learn from everybody. You know, that's, and I says, then you'll be successful. You may have to be the final decision maker, but listen to everybody and learn from everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you. We'll take Janet and then Dan and then final thoughts from Monica and Jim before we depart. Janet.
So our group found that we, from what Monica was saying, that we should listen more and being curious rather than being a lecturers. And then we realized this is going to be much harder than we ever imagined, because that's not been our modus operandi. So thank you, Monica, for bringing it to our attention. And it doesn't feel like it was criticism, but when we self-examine, we found a lot of changes needed.
Thank you, Janet. And Dan, bring us home.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks to our panelists today and the hosts. I appreciate you putting this on. In our group, we came across this commonality that where each of us sits within our own side is actually maybe part of the source of the conflict for us and part of where we're struggling. I know that if I were to show up to a Braver Angels event and be paired with somebody who leans red while I lean blue, we're here with the intention of talking across difference, and we're willing to have that conversation. I'm struggling with the people further left of me on my own side and getting them to see the value in this and not hold such a rigid ideological position, and not even being willing to come to the table. So I wonder if either of you, Monica or Jim, have any insight into how to impress upon people in your own, leaning your own way, the value of doing this work.
I've had discussions with my wife every now and then, particularly as we're getting older, and I go, and we'll be thinking a certain way that we probably shouldn't be, and I'll go, oh my God, we're not becoming our parents, are we? and so that tries to open up my own mind.
Yeah, I think there's kind of two questions that I see in there. One is, all right, what works, with people on this side that really kind of brings them in? What works with people on that side? And we could talk about that. But the other question is how do you get people on your side who don't think that there is any worthiness to this when you do think there's worthiness to this? And for me, it comes down to, and I think this goes across everything, is that when we're this divided, we're blinded. We just are. And it's about helping people kind of realize that. So what I do just in my own conversations is I try to represent the stories I have heard and the people I have met. So rather than telling people, you're wrong, you should listen to more people. We know that doesn't work. Instead, I'll say, I met someone the other day, or I talked to someone the other day who really helped me look at that very differently. And that's it. It's not a judgment on the person who agrees with me, but I'm offering something. And if I do it kind of gently enough, it just becomes a new conversation. And maybe that sparks some curiosity for them.
Thank you for that. That's really helpful. That's very helpful.
Jim, any final words from you?
Oh, this was interesting, and I really enjoyed hearing everybody. And I enjoyed the stories. Thank you so much. I learned a lot tonight. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. We appreciated you being here. And Monica.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I mean, I'm right there with Jim that the coolest thing is to listen and learn from everyone. So thanks everyone for sharing. And Jim, it was wonderful too to meet you tonight. And thanks for all your work. Anytime that I hear about more people in their own communities bridging divides for the good of our world and for the good of the people around us, like that's it. It doesn't have to happen on a huge grand scale. It's actually more about all the small scales adding up.
Thank you, Monica.
You.
Monica, Jim, it's been a pleasure having you here tonight. Thank you to everybody who showed up, and especially those of you who stuck around to the bitter end. Have a great rest of your evening, and we hope to see you at one of our events again here soon.
Good job.
Good night, everybody.
Good job.
Good night. Thanks all.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.